When the United States started industrializing and urbanizing, we started back in the early 1800s. And so we have had generations to adapt to a more urbanized environment. And so we have this middle step where we went from farms to small towns to big towns to cities, and the cities have suburbs. And so there's always been a degree of elbow room put into the American model, which lowers the opportunity cost of having children. China didn't start to urbanize until 1980. And then they did it all at once. So people in a single generation went from living on a subsistence farm to a high-rise condo. And so they went from having 7 kids to 1 kid in 1 generation. The one-child policy was on top of that. And now that it's been more than 40 years, they don't have a lot of people aged under 40. There's no one left to have the next generation. So this was always going to be the last generation for the People's Republic. It was always going to be a 2-generation experience total. But it's happened so fast that we don't even have an economic theory developed. Humankind does not have an economic theory for what would allow the Chinese economy to function in 2030. It's that far gone. In the United States, we are a large population, 330 million. In order to round out our younger age groups, we really need to bring in about 2 to 4 million immigrants a year. And we're well under that right now. And that is something that will come back to bite us again and again and again in the decades to come. But we're also a settler society. None of us are actually from here. And so the United States is capable politically of sustaining large volumes of immigration for an extended period of time. Just now is not one of those moments. Immigration can be part of our solution. There's a lot of complications in that conversation, politically, logistically. That's a different conversation we can get into if you want to. But the United States is the largest economy in the world with the greatest upward mobility from people from the lower classes to the higher classes. And the attractiveness of that system, especially since it's mostly free, is robust. And you're right that when we do decide to have an open immigration system, we usually have no problem drawing in people. And that's before you consider what's about to happen to the wider world, where the delta between the US and everyone else is going to be huge. There's 3 reasons that won't work. Number 1 is scale. The United States has over 300 million people. The Chinese have about 1.3 billion. So to move the needle, you don't just need to bring in 3 times as many people. You need to bring in 10 times as many people under age 40. It's not clear that there are enough people that are potentially migrant to salvage just China, assuming no one else moves anywhere else. Number 2, the United States has developed an interesting reputation of late of being a little bit racist, with white people being a little sketchy. But in China, which is 90% Han Chinese, they are blindingly racist to anyone who is not Han. And to think that there are going to be incentives that will draw people, especially in numbers, to the PRC is ridiculous, even before you consider the disconnect in terms of economic activity. But third, there's the governing system. The US may be a flawed democracy, but a democracy it still is. China is a country where you are welded into your room when there's a health crisis. The casual dismissal of the very concept that private citizens have agency or interests is something that does not attract migrants. Yeah, China has never had net inward migration. It's always been outward, people trying to get out, not people trying to get in. Now, there is migration within the Chinese system. People forget that China is not a traditional nation state. It is an empire.
Right.
And they have expanded out and conquered other groups. And you do get migrant from those poorer minorities into the urban centers. But again, you can only do that once, because then you've hollowed out the countryside. And that is what has happened writ large throughout the entire system at this point. Remember that there are 2 things you need for globalization to work. Number 1, you need the physical interconnectivity, the transport systems that are low cost and very, very safe. The cost of transport per unit, the more steps you can get in your supply chain, the greater capacity there is to expand into things that otherwise would be so low cost that you wouldn't trade them internationally. Things like wheat, for example, or plastics. Second, you need a balance of production and consumption. And that in many ways is a subset of demographic structures. So you need to have a significant number of people in your 40s, 50s, and early 60s in order to generate the capital and the skilled labor base to produce. And you also need a lot of people in their 20s and 30s to do some of the lower skilled stuff as well as consume. And this all has to be in balance for it to work. The demographic aging we've seen in recent decades means that second piece is just completely gone. And countries are increasingly finding it in their best interest to kind of hoard what consumption they do have and not allow trade access to it, and then producing more locally. We were moving this way before the Ukraine war, before the Chinese started to break down, and before the German industrial model started to implode. This has just sped everything up. As for the first end with transport, we're kind of in this hanging moment where we're waiting for someone to take the first shot, now that the Americans lack the capacity to protect the system. But even if we don't get a formal conflict over transport, by everyone kind of hoarding the production and consumption zones for themselves, we no longer have a vested interest anywhere in the world in what happens over the horizon. And as long as that is the case, we can get regional transport breakdowns that from our point of view don't affect us. But from everyone else's point of view, it's a bit of a disaster. And the more linked in your country is to these networks, the more vulnerable you are. So China, Korea, Germany, very much so at the very top of that list for different reasons. But they're all dependent upon the inflow and outflow. And so you can damage global transport significantly before the Americans really notice. Not only is the United States one of the world's biggest mining countries for raw materials, so is Canada, so is Mexico. Brazil isn't that far away, and it's all in the same hemisphere. So you can have an Eastern Hemispheric breakdown, which today, 3/4 of population, 3/4 of energy, 3/4 of food production, 3/4 of manufactured goods. And for the most part, the Western Hemisphere actually does. Here's the world's the world's export-led systems. They're aging out. They disappear as a class. We only have one post-growth economy. That's Japan. They've already aged into mass retirement. But if you fast forward 10 years and look at the demographics, this is already over. Consumption has already peaked. Production is peaking right now. Global capital supplies peak this year. None of them will return in our lifetime. You want to grow some more 40-year-olds? It takes 40 years. And all of this was before coronavirus. Coronavirus has driven all the consumption-led systems offline and into recession at the same time. So if you're an exporting nation, it really doesn't matter if you can beat the virus because you have no one to sell to. Let's look at the comparison that everyone in India loves to make. Now here we've got India and China in the year 2000. But as we all know, the Chinese have a one-child policy. So you fast forward that today, and China has now the world's fastest aging demography. Best case scenario, assuming nothing else goes wrong, in the year 2100, there'll be fewer than half as many Chinese as there are today. In calendar year 2020, the Chinese birth rate collapsed, dropped by almost a quarter. And remember, it takes 9 months to have a kid. That means the birth rate in 2020 reflected 2019 conditions. They haven't had their coronavirus crash yet. Now look at India today. It's aging too. India might be resistant to deglobalization, but it's urbanized right alongside everyone else. India's birth rate began to contract 25 years ago. Contraction sharply accelerated a decade ago. That means India in 2021 is aging at a similar rate to what China aged at back in 1980. That would suggest in the worst, India still has 40 years of demographic dividends to reap. That's great. India faces little of the demographic pressure that plagues not just China, but most of the world. Now, that doesn't mean that there are no clouds in these silver linings. India has the world's worst sex imbalance. In 2030, there will be 50 million surplus men under 45, concentrated in the Hindu belt. That is a social and a political stability issue. If Indian women today think that there's issues in Indian gender relations, look out. In consumption-based systems, having half your population exist is, in essence, a lower caste, has implications for technological progress, investment capacity, and, of course, consumption. Let me put that into a little bit more context. On the left, we are looking at population density. On the right, we're looking at per capita income. So on the left, the red and the orange are the particularly densely populated regions, while blue and green are less dense. On the right, the red and orange are the poorer regions, while the blue and green are the wealthier ones in per capita terms. There's a moderately strong correlation between population density and personal economic performance, particularly in the Hindu belt. Now, I'm not telling you anything that you haven't heard before here. For India, this contest between population and prosperity has always been an issue. My point is that in a world in which global capital supplies are about to collapse, this disconnect is going to sharpen. It will not go away. But at least it's a problem that is a familiar. It isn't like India is going to be struggling with the collapse of a trade-based model or a consumption-based model or an export-based model or a capital-intensive model. The problems India will have are the problems India already know. You have methods for dealing with them. Perfect. But at least
Your basic understanding of your domestic economy is not going to change. The devil you know. The devil China knows is